The healthcare team, Medio IGC 202, Unit 1. Okay, I'm Dr. Isabel Souza, your presenter for today. You have heard my bio before, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. I'm happy to be with you in these series. The professional focus. Patients are the reason for our work in healthcare. Definitely it's something that we always keep in mind, that our work is related to the purpose of healthcare, which is to improve patients' well-being. Exceptional service to patients is of the utmost importance. So we can't disassociate ourselves from, the goals of the working environment we're in. And that's something that at first interpreters, we think about ourselves as linguists and we go in and we're interpreting for the communication, but we are part of the healthcare service apparatus. What we do and how we behave and how we uphold our services will make a difference in the quality of the healthcare services provided. So we really need to have that professional focus. And I'll just mention that patient-centered care is a concept that came about maybe a decade ago, and it really restated that patients should be at the center of all the decision-making and care. So any situation where, the provider was not looking at the patient as the utmost, how can I put this? So when in patient-centered care, the patient is at the center of everything. So we need to cater to the patient as an individual. We need to cater to the patient's needs, and each patient has unique needs. So that's the biggest difference, is that we're looking at patients in a different way. So let's go to the next slide. And you'll see cultural diversity and healthcare. We're all diverse, every single individual, but we're starting to see in healthcare sort of a magnification of this diversity. I mean, many healthcare organizations are starting to look like the United Nations, because everybody is from a different country, a different culture, whether it's the providers that are coming from all over the world, especially in the US, this diversity is huge. And then the patient population, depending on the city, is more diverse than perhaps 50, 100 years ago. Some of the obvious manifestations of cultural diversity are religion, ethnicity, which is not the same as race, national origin, gender, and even other factors such as, educational background or rural versus city individuals or urban can really, change things. The interesting thing about cultural diversity is that just like an iceberg, we can only see so much on the top of the iceberg, and we don't realize there's so much more underneath. So if someone shows up in a burqa, we can imagine that person has, a Muslim faith. Some religious backgrounds are not so easily seen, whereas others are. The ethnicity, we can typically, based on the person's language, we can have some idea of their ethnicity, but it's not the same as a race. And I'll just give you an example. Hispanics are oftentimes treated as a race when actually they're an ethnicity. You can have a white Hispanic, a black Hispanic, a native Hispanic, a mixed Hispanic, and Hispanics can come in any race, just like everybody else. And even race, which is a human construct, can have many more layers of complexity than we've given it. National origin, I mentioned, discrimination against national origin is forbidden, and we might, not realize it, but gender and age can actually enhance the diversity of people and can become an issue, which we'll address later. So let's go to moving on to the next point. To the next slide. Who is a healthcare provider? The individual responsible for coordinating and delivering healthcare services. Here's some examples: a physician, a nurse practitioner, a physician assistant, a certified nurse midwife. These are all healthcare providers, and we'll explain a little bit more further along. So moving on, the physician. The physician typically provides preventative care with the annual physicals. Many of the physicians are primary care physicians. Insurance companies typically, call these primary care physicians, which are the physicians that we will see first before we see other specialized physicians. So, for example, family practice, internal medicine, pediatrics. These are the primary physicians that we will go to. And if the issue requires more, then they will refer us to a specialist. And that's why many will say that they act as gatekeepers for managed care plans. So if your insurance requires you to have a referral, that means you're going to have to see your PCP, often called PCP, so that they can see you and really determine if you really need to see that specialist. And if so, they'll refer you to them. They're responsible for supervising other providers. And their education is typically a medical school. Usually they have an MD behind their name, or DO, Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine. They typically require licensure, residency, and board certification in order to practice. And why do they need all that? Because of liability issues. Let's move on to the next category that we're going to address: physician assistant, or PA. You're really going to hear a lot of medical jargon when you're interpreting, so get used to the PCP, PA, because that's what you're going to hear much more than the full term. The physician assistant provides routine health care under the supervision of a physician. They may have prescription privileges, but they must pass an examination in order to practice. So they're very similar to physicians, except that they work under the supervision of a physician. Now, some countries might not have this category, and that's something that we often have issues with when we're interpreting, trying to explain the category. We have to rephrase it, or we ask the individual to explain it so we can interpret. But don't interpret it literally, because in many countries there is no such a thing, and a physician assistant would mean something very different. It would mean anybody who's assisting a physician, and that's not the meaning here. This is a profession, it's a position that's completely regulated, and the physician assistant profession, but again, in the US. Let's move on to the next category: nurse practitioner. A nurse practitioner is an advanced practice nurse. What we mean by practice nurse is that it's a nurse with her own practice, meaning that she will or he will see patients. Typically, nurse practitioners diagnose and treat patients in a chosen field. They practice under the supervision of a physician, but not under the physician isn't going to come in the room to check on their work. They really do have quite a bit of autonomy. They usually have prescription privileges, and they need to pass an examination in order to practice. And then you have a certified nurse practitioner, or CNP. Now, a little note here. It's different from a specialized nurse. Okay, that's a different thing. So a nurse practitioner is a profession, again, in the US, that it comes from the nursing field, but it gives the nurse almost the same abilities as a doctor. But that nurse is working under the supervision of a doctor. So it's sort of a hybrid position between nurse and doctor. And it's becoming more and more common in the US, and actually many healthcare insurance companies will allow an NP to be your primary physician. So, you know, things are changing. Let's go on to the next one. Certified Nurse Midwife, CNM. This is a nurse with advanced practice nurse, specialized in obstetrics and gynecology. They have certification requirements that vary from state to state, and certified nurse midwives are able to, you know, oversee birth on, you know, on their own, but typically they have a connection with a physician gynecology service, so that if there's a complication or something that requires surgery, for example, that the patient would be able to be moved. They don't perform surgery, for example, but they're very well trained in birthing. So let's move on to the next. Other providers. So we can't list all the providers in the healthcare system. There are too many, but it's good to become familiar with their names and what they do. But every specialty has their own specialist. A podiatrist will treat disorders of the foot and lower leg, prescribes medications, performs surgeries, treats fractures. All providers do. A chiropractor treats disorders of the musculoskeletal system, manipulates and adjusts the spine. They treat patients with ultrasound and massage. They will need, you know, certain diagnostic tools like MRIs, which are magnetic resonance imaging exams, but they don't perform surgery. They don't prescribe drugs, and they must be licensed in the state they're practicing. Optometrist performs eye examination, prescribes corrective lens to correct vision problems, does not perform surgery, and doesn't prescribe drugs. So the last two here, I guess just to make a distinction, you know, there are certain providers that don't do surgery and don't prescribe, but many of the specialists, whether it's a gastroenterologist or maybe it's an oncologist or any other, you know, neurologist, these providers will typically run the gamut in their specialization. So we're going to end this unit here, and I thank you very much for listening.